Great. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So welcome back to our Energy Institute members and all of you who attended our previous events and workshops. And particularly a warm welcome to those who are joining us for the first time for this event. As a very brief introduction, my name is Piotr. I'm a board member of the Energy Institute Young Professionals Network in the Middle East. I'm joined today by my fellow committee members, Shahta and Andy, as well as, most importantly, the leader of today's workshop, Ms. Kirsty Gogan. It's a huge pleasure to have you with us, Kirsty, tonight. And in today's workshop, we'll be talking about the topic of the future of nuclear energy. However, before we jump into it, I just wanted to say a few words about us, who we are as the Energy Institute, as well as give it a few more minutes for people to join the event. So if we can move on to the next slide, thank you. Energy Institute is a professional membership body for the global energy industry. We are delivering good practice and professionalism across the depth and breadth of the sector through knowledge and skills development. That's us in a nutshell. And then on the next slide, what you see is that as a member of the Energy Institute, you can get access to a lot of great material to accelerate your career, such as knowledge base, skills development, and good practice. So if you are interested in joining the Energy Institute as a member, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us after this webinar or at any time, really. And also, you know, please feel, even if you're not a member, please feel free to follow our calendar of events, and having joined this event also automatically puts us on a mailing list. All of our webinars are being recorded kind of in a podcast format and are available on YouTube immediately after the event. In terms of the local representation of the Middle East branch, the Energy Institute is led by Honorary Chairman Dr. Wada Kanem, as well as Trevor Stone-Briggs, who are distinguished professionals with many years of experience in the energy industry, and this kind of gives you an idea of day-to-day who we get to interact and network and be led by when you're members of the Energy Institute. The Young Professionals Network itself was established within the Energy Institute in the Middle East just last year in 2019. And we are a part of a wider network of branches, which spans almost across the world, across the four continents where we have our presence. And we, as the model of organization, we act as a hub for tomorrow's energy leaders. And generally, we aim to build a platform where young professionals and students like yourselves can grow and develop their networks. In terms of the YPN committee, I've mentioned some names, but just to show some faces too. Besides myself, I would like to introduce Shahta Altaya and Andy Webster, who are both working in the energy industry in the Middle East. And we're very excited and motivated to continue developing this network of young professionals in the Middle East. And with that, I'll pass to Shahta to tell you a little bit more about our activities specifically. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Piotr. I think it's important to know that here at the Young Professionals Network, our mission and focus is really the development of our members. We're also focusing on growing the scale and impact of the YPN network, and that's through collaborating with some important and key partners, such as educational institutes, universities, and research centers, and so on, as well as organizations and corporates with industry knowledge. I think that this just gives you an idea about some of the events and some of the thoughts that we had in how we can ensure the prosperity and the growth of the YPN network. So we have speaker events like today's event, for example, that's led by a speaker who shares their insights on key topics that are relevant to young professionals. We also have plans for more networking sessions. So the next session, which is happening on the 16th of November, will be our very first virtual networking session. So we hope that everyone here on this call can join us and really take advantage of this opportunity to network virtually now that you don't have access to conferences and the same opportunities before. I think another way that the YPN can really support you in your professional development can be in terms of getting the chartership support in building up your application and becoming a chartered engineer in your field of interest. And it can also, the network can also provide you with free access to our online library of resources, thought leadership, and publications on good practice in many fields related to the energy sector. Another thing that we're also planning to bring back once the situation improves is more site visits, and that will really give you hands-on experience as young professionals about what's going on sites and how things are very different, and that will really give you a lot of insights. Mentorship is also another key area that we're very keen on here at the Energy Institute, and we'll be rolling out a mentorship program very, very soon in the next couple of weeks or so, I believe, that you can all be part of. And just to give you an idea about some of the initiatives and umbrellas that we're also part of, I think these series of events have been very much geared at providing young professionals a chance to engage in the big debates around the energy sector, whether that's related to climate change, energy access, energy security, and also a lot of focus on developing key skills and competencies that can really help our young professionals in meeting the demands of tomorrow. So that's under the umbrella of Generation 2050, and you can find out more information about that initiative in the link that's on the screen. But just to give you an idea on some of the other initiatives that we've had and some of the other events, I think we started with sitting down with you, young professionals, and discussing how you can shape the energy industry in the Middle East. We've also had some workshops and some webinars on sustainability, future of engineers and practitioners in energy, some of the impacts and opportunities and threats of COVID-19, and a focus on talent and competency development as well. These are kind of some of the big panel discussions and webinars that we've had in the past, but for the past few months, we've been having a lot of these virtual workshops that really focus on key skills and competencies. So we've had some on data science, on emotional intelligence, recruitment tips, getting things done with deep work, and the last one that we had was about green buildings and entrepreneurship. And of course, today's session is focusing more about driving deeper decarbonization with nuclear energy. And the next session, as I mentioned, will be in 2 weeks' time. So mark your calendars for the 16th of November at 6 p.m. UAE time for our very first virtual networking session. And to kind of jump to today's discussion, I would like to introduce our speaker, Kirsty Gogan, who will be sharing some of her insights on driving deeper decarbonization with nuclear energy. Kirsty is a managing director at LucidCatalyst and Energy for Humanity. She's a highly specialized international consultant, and she offers her thought leadership, her strategy development, and techno-economic expertise for large-scale, affordable, market-based decarbonization of the global economy. She's also the chair of the UK government's Nuclear Innovation Research and Advisory Board. I'm sure that she has a lot of great expertise and insights to share with us. And I know that all of you here on the call are just as excited as I am to hear her thoughts. Kirsty, I'll hand over to you now.
Oh, thanks so much, Shada. And thank you all of you for inviting me to speak with you today. And actually, this is a really special opportunity for me because I was just very recently appointed a fellow. In fact, I have it right here, fellow of the Energy Institute. So here is my certificate that I just received in the post. So I'm really delighted to begin participating in the network. So very prescient of you, Andy, and others to invite me along. So I'm going to share my screen now. And hopefully, yes, I'm going to stop somebody else's screen sharing and share mine. I have some slides that I'll run through with you, which I'll just play from the start. And yeah, it's really about driving deeper decarbonisation with nuclear energy, and with a particular focus actually outside the power sector to the fuels challenge, which you'll see is actually an even larger potential market opportunity for nuclear technology than the power sector, and all within very rapid timescales. You'll notice the subheading here on the opening slide is 30 years to 2050. So let's start by sort of setting the scene a little bit. All the mainstream projections indicate that more than half of our energy is going to come from fossil fuels by 2050. IEA, this shows you the International Energy Agency's stated policy scenarios, but BP, DNV, EIA, everywhere you look, they're all projecting at least 50% fossil fuel use by 2050, which puts us onto a 4-degree warming trajectory as opposed to the 1.5 to 2 degrees target set by the Paris Agreement. So what do we need to do to avoid that really kind of catastrophic outcome? Well, here's as a brief to-do list. If we're going to achieve the reduction in carbon emissions that have been identified by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is of course, the IPCC famous chart that I'm sure many of you will have seen before. It's a slope so steep that you wouldn't want to ski down it. In order to achieve that very, very dramatic carbon emissions reduction within a very short time period, within those 30 years, we'll have to do things like repower all of our coal plants with a new heat source. Worth noting that although we're celebrating closing old coal in the United States and Europe, actually the average age of the global coal fleet is getting younger, and that's because many new coal-fired plants are being built around the world, and of course they do represent prosperity. They bring enormous socioeconomic benefits to the communities that benefit from that electricity generation and the jobs that are created. And we just cannot assume that infrastructure will just be abandoned. Not only the investment in the assets itself, but also the associated infrastructure, in particular the transmission. So it's really worth thinking about the potential for the application of nuclear heat to repower those coal plants without emissions, and repurposing that infrastructure and all of the benefits that brings. We need to convert all liquid fuel use to carbon neutral fuels, and that's mainly what I'll be talking about today, replacing natural gas as well as oil for transport and other uses with hydrogen, or more likely hydrogen-enabled synthetic fuels, whilst enabling a massive increase in generating capacity, particularly in Africa. It's very, very troubling to me that BP, for example, anticipates that the number of people that lack access to electricity at all will increase from today's figure of 840 million people to 3 billion people by 2040. So really, we cannot, from a sort of ethical perspective, and also from a realism perspective, avoid building in massive increases in energy use, as well as building out our climate mitigation strategies. What we need actually is climate prosperity. And then, yes, we need to electrify as much as possible, really, really fast. Now, I'm going to give you an analogy here that we like to use when we think about the kinds of solutions that we need to be developing in order to achieve the scale of transition within those very rapid time scales. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Impossible Burger. It's a plant-based substitute for meat, and it's honestly incredible how widely available that is now. You can buy this plant-based substitute in almost every Burger King in the United States, and people are switching to that option. And they're not doing it necessarily because they've decided to become vegetarian, but basically these plant-based substitutes look like a burger, they taste like a burger, they cost the same as a burger, and you can buy them through the existing supply chain. And that has enabled a very rapid switch that we think we need for all of our climate solutions, need to be effectively drop-in substitutes in terms of cost and performance, just the same as the fossil fuels that we use today. We shouldn't really be expecting people to pay more or change their behavior in order to enable that switch. So let's look now at the fuels decarbonisation challenge. And this really is about driving that deeper decarbonisation with nuclear energy. Because don't forget that these projections that I showed you a moment ago of fossil fuel use by 2050, or this goes up to 2040, assumes a massive expansion of renewables and a very effective energy efficiency. But despite that, we're still anticipating using 100 million barrels of oil per day. So the scale here is enormous. And the reason that we see those projections of that oil almost untouched through to 2040 is because, frankly, there just aren't cost competitive, credible pathways to decarbonize those hard to abate sectors and provide those drop-in substitutes that are equivalent in terms of cost and performance to the fossil fuels that we use today. So what would it take for hydrogen to be cheap enough to be able to, be used as a feedstock for clean synthetic fuels that could replace those liquid fuels? This chart shows you that the hydrogen would need to cost less than $1.50. So you can see here the two bands showing the range of oil prices from very high oil prices, almost $100 a barrel, down to the low kind of $40 a barrel range. And the diagonal lines show the range of costs that hydrogen would need to be if it was to be used for the production of ammonia or synthetic hydrocarbons, with an input of carbon at either $50 a ton or $100 a ton. Now the pink line there showing the ammonia, if you wanted to use your hydrogen to make ammonia, which by the way you can use in diesel engines, combined cycle gas turbines, the marine industry are looking very seriously at that as its preferred alternative fuel, and the shipping industry, is equivalent to the world's fifth largest economy, Germany, for example, in terms of emissions. So the shipping industry is very large consumer and producer of emissions. If a consumer of oil, producer of emissions. So if we were to use ammonia instead in those ships, then your hydrogen would need to cost less than $1.50. If you wanted to make synthetic hydrocarbons that could be used in aviation, for example, then your hydrogen needs to be super cheap, like less than $1.10. And just to give you an idea, renewables produced hydrogen right now, no one anticipates that costing less than $3 a kilogram, which isn't even included on this chart. Now, this is a very detailed chart, which I'll encourage you to look at in more detail. We can come back to in the discussion. But it shows the hydrogen production costs for different energy sources, clean energy sources. So here we see hydrogen, hydrogen production from solar, wind, and clean heat sources. And within the clean heat bracket, we have nuclear technologies and we have geothermal. Now, the important thing to say here is that we assume that all of these facilities would be dedicated to hydrogen production, so using their full available capacity for the production of hydrogen. And interestingly, I find it really interesting that the Dogger Bank, which is an offshore wind project coming in at very, very low capital cost and has relatively high capacity factors, around 65% capacity factor, if that was dedicated to hydrogen production, it would make hydrogen that would cost cost more than a second of a kind gigawatt scale nuclear plant in the UK. So we have this sort of idea that nuclear new build is expensive, and yes, it is expensive in Europe and in the United States. But because of the very high capacity factors with nuclear, that actually is the key cost driver when it comes to hydrogen production. So you can also see there are some much lower cost outcomes in the nuclear data set there. With those within the sort of blue band at the bottom of the chart show those data points reaching those target hydrogen costs that we saw a moment ago. In other words, hydrogen produced within that blue range there would be able to access large markets, as opposed to the much more expensive hydrogen above $3 a kilogram, which really is only ever going to achieve niche applications. So how can we redeploy the oil and gas capability for really large scale clean hydrogen and synthetic fuels production and drive down costs into the very, very low ranges, whilst increasing production to the very large scale that will be needed to really start substituting for those very large market applications in shipping, industry, transport, aviation, and so on. Well, here you see one such concept, and we have a sort of theory of change for nuclear cost reduction that involves either bringing your project to the factory or bringing your factory to the project. And in this case, we're bringing the factory to the project, and this is a refinery scale hydrogen gigafactory, which we'd envisage as being located on former coastal refinery sites. This is envisaged to be actually in the UK. 10 of these would entirely replace the UK's current oil and gas consumption. It's a fully integrated manufacturing, installation and production facility, which enables extremely low costs of the hydrogen and synthetic fuels production. You can see the yellow pipes here in the foreground are piping the gas directly into the UK gas network. One of the things I find very interesting about this application for nuclear technology for the production of fuels, as opposed to the production of electricity, is that it completely transforms the siting constraints. If you're making electricity, you're constrained first of all by being located near transmission, so that you can actually, send your electricity to your consumers. And then you're also constrained by the size of the market. So ultimately you're tethered to, a 30-year power purchase agreement, which is determined by the market demand for the electricity. When you move into commodities production, those constraints are very transformed in terms of location and scale. So you no longer need to locate close to transmission or close to the end users, because you're making a product that can be stored, transported and exported to global markets. And you're also unconstrained in terms of scale. So here we have 36 high temperature reactors being installed onto this very large refinery scale site, producing commodities that can then be exported to global markets. Oops. And then the other approach that I mentioned is to bring your project to the factory. And in this case, we're bringing our project to some of the highest productivity manufacturing factories in the world, which are shipyards. And you can see here the shipyard construction of a floating production platform. So really sort of two innovations here. First of all, the innovation of moving your plant construction to a very high productivity manufacturing environment that incorporates parallel construction, as well as very, very high quality automated installation and supervision, whilst also moving to a very innovative deployment model. So you have a very innovative delivery model and a very innovative deployment model. And you can see here a platform that's moored off the coast of Ghana, producing power which is being cabled into shore, much as you would expect with an offshore wind farm, for example. as well as producing hydrogen and ammonia, which can be used directly in existing decentralized generating infrastructure in the developing country, in diesel engines, in diesel generators, in combined cycle gas turbines. And one of the features of this multi-product platform that I particularly like is that it also is using the waste heat from the high temperature reactors to desalinate a large enough amount of water to supply the entire city region of Accra per day. So really, incredible multi-product platform that also presents a very different investor proposition for major infrastructure development in the developing world countries. Because, if your customer for some reason decides not to pay, then you can actually remove your facility. Hopefully that's not going to be the case, but it does really change very much the investor proposition. Here's another example of this is a much larger floating platform, very much based on the sort of kinds of facilities that are FPSOs, very familiar to the oil and gas sector, where they have very, very large floating facilities, mostly applied, of course, to the oil and gas sectors. In this case, applied to the production of ammonia. This is a 400-meter platform, offloading ammonia from a production platform. We have a new report coming out in the beginning of December, which describes very, very detailed techno-economic analysis for these scenarios that I'm showing you today. So you'll be able to really sort of dig in, if you're interested, into a lot more detail. But just to give you a flavor, here are the kinds of prices for hydrogen that we'd expect to be able to achieve through the application of these kinds of new innovative technology configurations, informed obviously by these very innovative delivery and deployment models. So for the gigafactory, for example, we'd expect to see hydrogen produced for well under $1. So if we're targeting 90 cents for the production of synthetic hydrocarbons for aviation, competitive aviation fuel, for example, then the gigafactory would be delivering that, as indeed would the shipyard manufactured plant. It's worth noting that the renewables cost data points that you're seeing here, nobody is anticipating that these would be achieved before 2050, whereas the very innovative nuclear technologies combined with thermochemical electrolysis, for example, that provide for very, very efficient electrolysis combined with these high capacity factors, would be achievable really by 2030, which means that we have a sort of, fighting chance of actually addressing those hard to decarbonize markets for the other 50% of decarbonisation that we have to achieve within the 2050 timeframe. So unfortunately, nobody sees renewables achieving those necessary low costs within the time frame that's needed. So there's a real question about what we do in the meantime, and therefore why not look at nuclear technologies. But in addition, the renewables data points that you're seeing here that may get down to these low costs by 2050 will be very limited to locations where the resources are available that may well be quite remote, so Western Australia, Northern Africa, the Middle East. But then you also have to take into account transportation costs, which can make quite a major impact on the end cost of the fuel. Now, if you were to apply what our report, The Missing Link to a Livable Climate, shows, that if you were to apply these very innovative technology solutions to the production of clean synthetic fuels, that it would be achievable to substitute fossil fuels in the hard to decarbonize sectors between the 2020 to 2050 timeline. And here's the chart that shows that transition taking place. We've also done some analysis around what that would cost to achieve that full transition for the 100 million barrels of oil per day. And we started by looking at what the oil and gas sector is intending to spend anyway on sustaining that flow of oil, which amounts to around $24 trillion for exploration and development within those 3 decades to sustain the existing flow of oil into the global economy. the application of our innovative facilities, we'd estimate to cost considerably less, around $18 trillion, to achieve the same, to achieve the equivalent oil and gas flow. So as my 9-year-old put it very well, he said, wait, so you mean it's going to be cheaper to save the world than to destroy it? I think sort of sums it up. And by contrast, trying to achieve that same energy flow just with renewables, power to fuels, would cost much more, in the region of around $70 trillion. So very significant difference there. And it's worth noting, of course, that we really ought to be focusing on trying to use capital that's already circulating in the global economy, coming back to the impossible burger idea that we cannot assume that a lot of additional money is going to be available. So what would it take? You know, what are we talking about here in terms of the number of platforms that would be required to entirely replace the world's oil flows? Well, we're talking about around about sort of 15,000 production facilities. And to build those would take about 60 shipyards. So just to give you an idea, there's about 250 world-class shipyards operating in the world today. Most of those really only at about 50% capacity. Many of those obviously wouldn't already be upgraded to be able to produce these platforms, and would have to be, you know, require investment and so on. But interestingly, many of these platforms that we're describing are actually a lot less complicated than those that are already being built in the oil and gas sectors. So really very achievable. And we're doing further studies on, you know, to get a final resolution on shipyard capability and capacity in the world today, and the kinds of investments that would be required to build it up. But it really is an incredible opportunity, particularly actually for the UAE, that has already got global world-class shipyards. This set of slides I won't dwell on too much. Many of you may have previously seen work that we've done around what drives the cost of nuclear new build. And what we found is that actually the majority of nuclear builds projects around the world today are very cost competitive and achieving quite, you know, impressive schedules. I think the average cost of nuclear new build in the world, conventional nuclear new build in the world today, is about $4,000 a kilowatt. So very, very different from the kinds of really unrepresentative samples that we see in Europe and the United States, that creates a very strong impression that nuclear is too expensive and slow to make a contribution towards solving climate change. In fact, these first of a kind, first in a generation projects really aren't representative of the kinds of costs that are achievable once you've established skills and capability within the supply chain. And critically, as as we saw at Barakar, building, you know, multiple units on a single site is a very, very important way of achieving a lower cost across the project. So here's what we see in terms of the cost reduction that's very, very achievable, very explainable, very understandable from a first of a kind project where you have to invest in your design, in building up skills and capability within the supply chain and the labour force and the project leadership teams and so on, to then the kinds of cost reductions that are achievable so long as you standardise and you retain that skill and capability, and sequence through to subsequent projects based on standardised designs. We can see here the US best experience, which is the group of plants that achieved a cost that's really equivalent to the global average today during the course of the United States program of build, around $4,000 a kilowatt. Just to illustrate that it isn't just in Asia that this is achievable, but actually we've done it before in the US and in Europe as well. And here we have the sort of the best experience, $4,000 a kilowatt, and the kinds of cost reductions that we'd expect to see by moving from traditional construction to a much more highly efficient, highly productive manufacturing environment, such as a shipyard. And there you can start to see where we get down below $2,000 a kilowatt, down, you know, almost $1,500 a kilowatt. And then this just shows you the sort of transition as we establish the capability within the shipyards, we'd start to get down, you know, around about $1,500 a kilowatt and into mass production. So this sort of tells the story of cost reduction. And then there's one final constraint. We've looked at costs, we've looked at investments that are required, we've looked at rates of deployment. let's take a look at space. So I've got a couple of maps just to finish on now, which are comparing the area that would be required if we were to try to replace the UK's current oil consumption with hydrogen that's generated from either wind, solar, or advanced heat sources. And you can see the big pink shape there represents a single continuous offshore wind farm. And remember, this is just for hydrogen production. This is dedicated to hydrogen production. So I don't know where they're going to put all the offshore wind that's intended to be built for the decarbonisation of the electricity sector, which, you know, I think a lot of that space is already bookmarked for that. And then you can see the big yellow square there is the space that would be required if you were to try to make all of that hydrogen with solar, which I can tell you is going to be politically and publicly infeasible. And then hopefully you can see the little green dot there, which is the footprint of the entire sort of nuclear technology fleet that would be required to produce all of that hydrogen. Now, this is a thought experiment. Obviously, nobody's suggesting that we would centrally locate all of the hydrogen production in one location, but I think it's a sort of instructive to see the kinds of space requirements that we're talking about here. Here's another example showing Japan's current oil consumption and the footprint that would be required for hydrogen produced either from wind, again the big pink space there, or indeed solar, and then we had to put it a little arrow in so that the nuclear dot is even visible. And, you know, again, a thought experiment. Clearly this coast would not necessarily be developable. It's actually too deep, and there may also be other geopolitical considerations. And likewise, you know, Japan is incredibly mountainous, and in fact, it's quite impractical and infeasible to consider that you would even be able to develop that kind of space for solar production anyway. And again, the same thing really applies with Korea, which is the final map. But again, it's instructive to have a sense of the kinds of requirements that would be needed. And indeed, it's instructive to start to become a bit more realistic about the nature of the infrastructure scale that's going to be needed for this global clean energy transition whilst meeting rising global energy demand. So really our goal is to sort of ensure that nuclear technology potential is properly represented, and that we're applying the same creativity and commitment to developing strategies for driving down costs and increasing rates of deployment, as we have done really successfully in the renewable sectors, but we haven't yet applied to the nuclear technology. So there's lots of room there for all kinds of improvements. And given, you know, our shared objectives of, you know, clean air and tackling climate change and enabling, you know, universal access to clean, reliable, affordable energy, you know, why wouldn't we do that? So I hope you'll have a chance to review our report at some point, a missing link to a livable climate. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So thank you all very much for your kind attention. And I will now hand back the mic to my dear colleagues. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Kirsty, for all that great insights and for all the data and information that you shared. I think now maybe we can open the floor for some questions. I can already see some in the chat box here. If you prefer to maybe read them and then answer them, then that would be great.
I'm just taking a look. Oh, thanks everyone. Can nuclear be deployed fast enough to meet the rapid energy transition? You framed at the start of the talk. Well, you know, that really is the sort of $64,000 question, or should I say the 16,000 production platforms question. You know, our sort of initial analysis suggests that firstly, the shipyard capacity is or could be available, and therefore the rate of deployment would be achievable. I think it's very interesting when we look at commodities production that we don't necessarily have the same constraints in terms of, you know, siting nuclear technologies site by site, because in market by market right now, when we think about, you know, locating a small modular reactor, for example, you sort of enter a big siting process and licensing process if you want to go into a new market, which often requires new design changes, which creates more investment and then risk that's required, and, you know, delays. Whereas actually, if you can centralize a lot of this production, you could have even just a small number of countries potentially deciding to do this and then doing it really at a very large scale, much like we see in the global oil industry today. Shall I take another question? Does hydrogen generation risk hazardous impacts on the environment in case of leakage, just like oil leakage? Yeah, so one of the reasons why we consider hydrogen as a feedstock rather than as an end-use fuel is because it's really difficult to store and transport. It's obviously a tiny molecule, it can escape really easily. It's, you know, and it would require a lot of new investment in associated infrastructure, pipelines and engines and so on. So we're thinking about using hydrogen to make drop-in substitute fuels that can be, you know, applied in all of the existing infrastructure. So you don't have to then, you know, invest in new storage and transport and end-use infrastructure. However, with ammonia, that does present some, you know, environmental challenges very clearly, but, you know, they're manageable. We understand them. We already manage them, and so it's not, you know, perfect, but it's very manageable. That's what I would say about that.
Another question, Kirsty, we had from Abdul Latif.
Yeah.
Does the control of this industry, including trade and use of uranium, add challenges to adopt the solution, the technology?
Yeah, could you expand a bit on that? I'd like to understand a bit more about.
Abdul Latif, feel free to unmute yourself and
Thanks.
then clarify.
Hi everyone. Hi Kirsty.
Hi.
My question is really, as you know, when it comes to building nuclear, you know, stations or reactors, and then buying the fuel for these stations, this is something, you know, not easily done, and it has to go through, I would say, several steps of getting, you know, approvals and permits from different authorities or even from different countries.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like just buying an oil or, you know, gas. So will this impose difficulties in adopting this technology? Because again, not every country can easily buy or, you know, build nuclear reactors and buy nuclear fuel.
Yeah, yeah. I guess the challenges are, you know, at the moment they're the same for conventional nuclear plants. So I don't think they'd be very different. The idea would be that the facilities would be fueled at their production location. So, for example, if you were manufacturing these machines in shipyards, you would then ship them to their location, and that could either be a sort of floating configuration or indeed brought into a harbour, which is then, you know, filled in, so it ends up essentially being an on-land plant, or the gigafactory configuration. And then, yeah, it would be for the country, for the host country to go through the appropriate licensing procedures. Ideally, obviously, what we'd really like to see is you know, much more product-based licensing regime to enable real design standardization in multiple markets. But I'd anticipate that what will happen is that countries that are either deciding already to pursue nuclear technology or already have nuclear technology would be the countries that they would be the early adopters for these technologies. And then there's a linked question here about the sort of oil and gas international standards and are there equivalent standards for the nuclear sector. We're working closely with Lloyd's Register, who are a third-party assurance entity, and they're really interesting because they have expertise in both marine and nuclear technologies. And so we're working with them to establish a sort of regulatory framework to understand, like a matrix, to see where existing regulatory requirements would apply and where there could be sort of, you know, new certifications, almost like a shipping certifications that could be developed for the application here.
Are there any other questions? I would encourage people to either unmute yourself, please, or post.
Yeah, I think there's
questions in the chat.
There's another question from Steer on the challenges for fusion nuclear plants, and just a clarification on your thoughts on how that's supposed to be more safe.
Is it not supposed to be? Yeah, and actually in our hydrogen production costs charts that I showed you, in the clean heat category, we actually do include fusion there too, and we're really interested in the potential application of fusion technologies for the same uses, and they may well, the fusion technologies may well prove much easier to license, especially in newcomer countries, than even the advanced fission, which is already, you know, a very different kind of paradigm in terms of safety and so on to the light water reactors that we have today. So, you know, there's definitely a sort of an evolution of requirements for regulatory oversight, and hopefully becoming more and more contained and less onerous as the technologies develop. So yeah, fusion would be very interesting. You know, I think the important thing that for me is that, you know, and increasingly we're talking about advanced heat sources rather than using the word nuclear, because actually it's the sort of high temperature heat, the high capacity factors, and the tiny environmental footprint, the power density, that really are the attributes that we care about. Those are the attributes combined with very low cost electricity production that can produce these very, very cheap synthetic fuels at the scale that we need. And, you know, so I'm trying where possible to avoid saying the word nuclear and even specifying, you know, fission and so on, because it's very, very loaded with all kinds of preconceptions. And actually I see a question here about waste disposal issues and causing controversy and so on. And, you know, it's there are unfortunately a lot of misconceptions about nuclear technology, or perceptions that are based on a very, very different era of nuclear technology, that can be very distracting from focusing on the potential outcomes. So yeah, we, you know, a good friend of mine said to me the other day about nuclear waste. He said, "Oh yes, well, you know, the imaginary problems are the most expensive to solve." And it is indeed, I think, really important that we look at all of the sort of costs and opportunities of all nuclear technologies in a very consistent way, in the context of the other risks that we face, including the profound risk of failing to decarbonize. And when you start to put those costs and opportunities into perspective, and do a very consistent evaluation of different energy technologies, personally, I find that nuclear technologies perform extremely well on almost every metric, including volume and management of waste.
On this topic, Kirsty, I think you raised an interesting point. When you talk about technologies like nuclear, other technologies, or even climate change, a lot lies in the strategic narratives when it comes to the perception of the public. What would you say are like the top misconceptions around nuclear energy that you think, you know, should really be corrected in the public eye, or public should really be more informed about when it comes to the acceptance of the technology?
Oh yeah, well, I think, you know, one thing I would say, if I could communicate one idea that nobody seems to know about nuclear, it would be $2,400 a kilowatt, and that's the cost of the you know, per unit of the new 4 units that are being built by the Chinese, the Hualong new reactor. Now, you know, yeah, not everyone can get will be able to get costs quite as low as China can. But our analysis suggests that we can actually achieve very, very competitive nuclear new build, even with conventional construction. And so there's a real myth out there that nuclear is too expensive and slow to make a meaningful contribution towards solving climate change, and the evidence just doesn't support that.
What about the perceptions of safety?
Yeah, I mean, my view on that, on the sort of, you know, traditional concerns that people have around safety and waste, the evidence suggests that those views are what's called very shallow. So they're not actually very deeply held. They're very actually relatively straightforward to overturn, and it is really a case of needing to have much better communication. Since the sort of 6 years or so that I've been doing my kind of non-profit advocacy for nuclear technology for environmental and humanitarian reasons, I've found that I've now been joined by just so many more people that are looking again at climate and are looking again at nuclear in light of climate and our larger energy challenges. And it really doesn't take a lot for people to very quickly realize that the technology that they think is the most dangerous is actually the safest. So yeah, we do need to, I mean, the industry does have to take some responsibility here, and I've noticed as well that the nuclear industry communications have been changing really dramatically over the recent years, from emphasizing safety and, you know, restating over and over again, you know, the learnings from the accidents and so on, reinforcing the perception that nuclear is very dangerous, much more towards an emphasis on the benefits that nuclear technology offers to society and to the environment. And really that sort of approach to external communications has been missing and is now increasingly front and center in the industry's communications. I think that's a very, very important transition, and reflects much more the way that other energy technologies communicate to the public and to stakeholders, is about the benefits that they bring. So.
Interesting. Shahta, do you want to ask your question? I see we have one in the chat.
Oh.
One.
Yeah, I was just wondering how, Kirsty, how you would imagine the next 30 years to look like in terms of any big ideas, big changes, or new technologies, or things like that.
So I described quite a lot about the application in the fuels sector, but there is, of course, there's still an incredibly important role that nuclear could play in the electricity generating sector. So let me describe that to you just as something fresh. So we've been looking at the market requirements for nuclear technologies in future electricity grids. And what we found is that in terms of cost and performance, nuclear technologies have to look a lot more like combined cycle gas plants. So they need to cost less than $3,000 a kilowatt to build, and they need to be really easy to build and easy to buy and easy to site, and easy to operate. And the way that you achieve that, you know, and more advanced reactor developers are doing this, they're separating the nuclear island from the rest of the energy island. And they're achieving that through having a sort of thermal energy storage, and it could be molten salt or it could be hot bricks. You know, you can choose your thermal energy storage system, but that allows you then to create a separation from a nuclear island that should be very, 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 very simplified. So instead of a kind of spaghetti junction, you need something that's very simple and clean and easy to build and standardize and understand by the regulator, that's separated from the power island, so that you could then, in order, when you're building, you have parallel construction, you have a very much smaller and very contained area for regulatory oversight, which overall reduces the regulatory risk in terms of, you know, design modifications and additional expense and schedule delays, and you have much less requirements for nuclear grade systems and components in your larger energy island, which enables you to buy commercial off-the-shelf systems and components. And then the thermal energy storage also performs an additional function, which turns your nuclear plant into a dispatchable, clean plant, which can generate all the time, either to charge the battery, which is the thermal energy storage, or to be, discharging to the grid and generating onto the grid, which allows you to load follow essentially with wind and solar. So fully flexible, highly economic, and extremely cost competitive, very easy to buy, because you've really dramatically reduced the regulatory uncertainty and the licensing requirements, and massively increased the amount of commercial components and systems in the system. So you end up buying something which looks a lot more like a normal power plant. So I think the future for nuclear is to move much more in that direction, to becoming a properly commercialized product. And one example of, if you want to have a look, the Natrium project, which is being developed by Bill Gates, illustrates all of these ideas very well.
Great. I think we're slowly running out of time. Thank you very much, Kirsty. It was a fascinating discussion. I would also like to thank everyone for the great questions. I think it was a very well summarized, just a wealth of data that would take someone weeks to research. So I think we've all been screenshotting and taking a lot of notes. I would also add that this talk was recorded and is going to be available on the Energy Institute's YouTube channel. So everybody can access it. I think we've Shaq, if you could post the link to that. I've posted it a little bit earlier. So once again, Kirsty, thank you so much. Very, very interesting evening. I would also encourage everyone to follow us on the Energy Institute's website for a future event. Next one is we'll be doing a virtual networking session for our members in 2 weeks. And yeah, thank you very much all for joining. And once again, Kirsty, congratulations on being awarded your fellowship with the Energy Institute.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me. Wonderful questions.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great evening and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.